There comes a moment in every empath's life when something inside them goes completely silent. Not broken, not angry, just done. Carl Jung discovered this was not depression. It was not burnout. It was not emotional exhaustion. He called it the final stage of spiritual awakening. And it terrifies everyone who witnesses it. Because when an empath stops caring, they do not become cruel. They become untouchable. And that changes everything. Jung spent decades studying patients who reached this state. What he found challenges almost everything we believe about empathy, about spirituality, and about what it actually means to transform. The moment the empath stops caring is not the end of their story. It is the beginning of something far more powerful. Before we understand why they stop, we have to see what brought them to the edge. Jung documented a consistent pattern across his most sensitive patients. These were not people who sometimes felt things deeply. These were people whose entire nervous system functioned as an emotional receiver. They walked into a room and immediately absorbed the psychological atmosphere. Family dinners left them drained from managing everyone's unspoken tension. Friendships exhausted them because they carried both sides of every conflict. Romantic relationships nearly destroyed them because they felt their partner's pain more intensely than their partner ever did. Jung called them the emotional shock absorbers of their social systems. They did not merely empathize with suffering. They absorbed it. They processed it. They transmuted it so that other people could keep functioning. Parents dumped their anxiety onto them. Siblings used them as unpaid therapists. Partners treated them like emotional support animals whose only job was to manage the mood of the house. And here is what made Jung's observations so disturbing. These empaths almost never complained. They accepted the role as their purpose. They believed their sensitivity existed to serve others, that their gift obligated them to sacrifice their own peace for everyone else's comfort. They wore their exhaustion like a badge of honor, proof they were good, proof they cared enough to suffer. The conditioning started early. From childhood, they were praised for being understanding, for making other people feel better, for keeping the peace. Every time they swallowed their own needs, they were validated. Every time they absorbed someone's anger to prevent a fight, they were told they were mature, beyond their years. That reinforcement created a lifelong pattern of self-abandonment that felt like virtue. But Jung noticed something the empaths themselves could not yet see. Behind the compassionate face, the psyche was keeping records. Every manipulation, every betrayal, every moment someone took advantage of their kindness. The unconscious was not absorbing these experiences at random. It was cataloging patterns with surgical precision. Imagine someone who spent 15 years managing their family's dysfunction. They knew exactly which words would trigger their mother's guilt. They understood the exact emotional sequence their father used to avoid accountability. They could predict when a sibling would manufacture a crisis just to recapture attention. They had mapped every psychological game around them the way a cartographer maps familiar territory. And yet they never used that knowledge as a weapon. Not once. They kept absorbing, kept caring, kept giving, until something fundamental inside them began to crack. Their consciousness had become a detailed archive of everyone else's patterns, while their own needs stayed buried under years of service and sacrifice. This created what Jung identified as a dangerous psychological split. On the surface, the empath looked functional, even thriving in the caretaker role. Underneath, resentment was building like pressure in a sealed container. Not the kind of resentment that can be spoken and released. Unconscious resentment that slowly poisoned their sense of self. The breaking point almost always came from betrayal, not ordinary disappointment. Profound betrayal from someone the empath had protected, defended, and loved without condition. Jung saw this trigger across case after case. He identified it as the catalyst that forces shadow integration. The story repeats with disturbing consistency. Someone discovers their partner's infidelity after years of managing that partner's instability, depression, and anxiety. An adult child learns a parent has been speaking cruelly about them after decades of being the family's emotional glue. A friend uncovers devastating lies after years of carrying secrets and offering unconditional support. What made these betrayals so destructive was not only the act itself. It was the sudden recognition that the warning signs had been there the entire time. The intuition had been screaming for months, sometimes years. They had silenced it. They had chosen to believe the best in someone who was already showing them exactly who they were. They had betrayed themselves to protect a fantasy of who the other person could become. That self-betrayal cut deeper than the external one. The empath realized they had participated in their own exploitation. They had ignored the inner voice, dismissed the gut feeling, and overridden every boundary to keep relationships that were destroying them. The anger was not only toward the betrayer, it was toward themselves for allowing it long after they knew better. That realization did not just break their heart, it shattered their illusions. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections. The empath had been projecting goodness, potential, and innocence onto people who did not possess those qualities. They had been seeing not who people actually were, but who they desperately needed them to be. When the projections finally collapsed, the empath did not cry or rage or fall apart the way everyone expected. Something far more unsettling happened. They became quiet, unnaturally calm. Their eyes changed, not with tears, with clarity. The fog lifted. For the first time, they saw reality without the distortion of desperate hope. Music Jung described this as one of the most chilling transformations he ever witnessed in clinical practice. The empath stopped performing emotional labor. They stopped managing other people's feelings. They stopped explaining, justifying, and apologizing for their own needs. They did not announce it. They did not make a speech. They simply stopped participating in the systems they had been holding together. Family members who relied on them to mediate suddenly had to face each other. Partners who used them as emotional crutches could no longer provoke the old reactions. Friends who treated them as free therapists ran into boundaries where endless availability used to be. The empath had withdrawn their energy from the emotional economy that depended on their exploitation. And here is what made it so disturbing to everyone around them. They were not angry. Anger would have been familiar, manageable, something people knew how to work with or manipulate. They knew the empath's anger always dissolved back into forgiveness and more caretaking. This was not anger. This was indifference to the games that used to control them. People tried everything. They manufactured crises. They played victim. They guilt-tripped. Nothing worked. The empath had unplugged from the matrix. They watched the attempts with detached curiosity, the way a scientist watches predictable behavior in a lab. Jung identified this as the integration of the shadow. Every empath carries a shadow they have been taught to deny, the part that is selfish, that prioritizes its own needs, that refuses to save people from themselves. Society told them that shadow was evil. Religion called selflessness a virtue. Culture praised endless sacrifice. Family systems rewarded self-abandonment. Jung understood the shadow was not evil. It was the survival instinct. It was the psychological immune system trying to keep the empath from being consumed by other people's dysfunction. When betrayal finally forced the integration, they did not become cruel. They became complete. The selfish shadow merged with the compassionate light. What emerged was something the world was not prepared for. An empath who can feel everything but chooses, consciously, where that feeling goes. An empath who sees through manipulation and no longer pretends otherwise. An empath who still loves deeply, but only those who have earned that love through reciprocity and respect. This is what Jung meant by the final stage of spiritual awakening. Not the death of the ego, the integration of every part of the self into conscious choice. The empath had spent a lifetime caring for others at their own expense. Now they were learning to care for themselves with the same intensity they once gave away. This was not selfishness. This was self-preservation, finally treated as sacred. The energy shift was immediate. Where they once radiated warmth to anyone who asked, they now offered something more selective. Not coldness, consciousness. They no longer leaked energy to whoever demanded it. Their presence felt different, grounded, impenetrable. Jung called it selective empathy. To some, it looked like boundaries. To others, it looked like cruelty. They stopped answering manipulative texts on command. They let the energy vampires go to voicemail. They said no to requests that used to trigger automatic yes. They skipped the family gatherings that always left them devastated. They ended one-sided friendships. They walked away from people they had spent years trying to save. What observers missed is this. They had not stopped caring about those people. They had stopped caring about relationships that required them to betray themselves. They had stopped caring about being liked by people who never truly valued them. They had stopped caring about keeping peace in systems built on their silent suffering. They finally understood what Jung tried to teach for decades. You cannot love others well until you love yourself first. Not the shallow version, the deep self-respect that refuses to participate in your own destruction. That foundation had been missing from every relationship they ever had. At work, the change shocked colleagues. The person who used to absorb everyone's stress and manage the office drama simply stopped. They did their work excellently, and nothing more. They attended meetings, but no longer fixed conflicts that were not theirs. They stayed pleasant and completely unreachable to the old manipulations. In the family, the shift was even more dramatic. The one who always hosted, always mediated, always absorbed, the dysfunction simply became unavailable for those roles. No announcement, no confrontation, just absence from the assignments they had carried since childhood. Parents discovered boundaries, siblings met limits, extended family faced a version of the empath they did not recognize, someone who smiled politely and did not enter the drama. Someone who loved from a distance instead of drowning in proximity. Someone who said, "That doesn't work for me," without explanation or apology. The family responded with shock. How could you be so selfish? What happened to you? You've changed. And the empath simply nodded. Yes. They had changed. They had finally stopped setting themselves on fire to keep other people warm. In romance, the transformation was the most complete. Some partnerships evolved. Partners who had taken the endless forgiveness for granted suddenly faced accountability. Old behaviors were no longer tolerated. The empath stopped explaining why things hurt. They simply left the situations that violated their peace. Some partners rose to meet the new version. They recognized what they had been given and chose to become worthy of it. Those relationships became healthier, more balanced, built on mutual respect instead of one-sided labor. Other partners could not adapt. They missed the version who absorbed everything and asked for nothing. When the old tactics failed, they often left in search of a new empath to exploit. The awakened one let them go without the usual agony. The departure was not loss. It was protection. Jung observed that this indifference created panic in the social circle, not because the empath became mean, but because their absence revealed how much dysfunction they had been hiding. Families that looked functional fell apart. Friendships that looked deep showed themselves as parasitic. Workplaces that ran smoothly descended into chaos without the invisible emotional labor. The people who had benefited from the unconscious servitude suddenly understood what they had lost. By then, the empath no longer cared about their realization. This was not revenge. This was sovereignty. They had learned that the gift was never meant for everyone. It was meant to be protected and shared only with those who valued it. Jung called the resulting state psychologically invincible, not because nothing could hurt them, but because they had integrated the capacity to feel everything with the wisdom to choose the response. They could still sense pain, still read rooms, still perceive what was never said. Those perceptions no longer ran them. They had become the director of their own empathy instead of its slave. They developed an almost automatic protection. They could identify narcissists within minutes. They recognized love bombing, future faking, and gaslighting before the tactics took root. They felt inauthentic energy and simply did not engage. The integrated consciousness became an early warning system. They could have used that insight to destroy the people who had hurt them. They knew the vulnerabilities, the fears, the weak points. They chose not to. They removed the toxic people and moved forward. The restraint was not weakness. It was genuine disinterest in revenge. Jung was struck by how much power they refused to abuse. Their presence created what he called the mirror effect. Inauthentic people became uncomfortable without a word being spoken. Manipulators felt exposed. Energy vampires sensed they could not feed and moved on. Authentic people, for the first time, felt safe. They recognized someone who saw them clearly and did not judge. The awakened empath became a living filter. Dysfunction was repelled. Growth was attracted. They no longer had to vet people actively. The integrated presence did it. Those who could not handle the clarity left. Those who wanted real connection came closer. The entire social circle changed without forced effort. They rebuilt on different foundations. Careers that honored the sensitivity instead of exploiting it. Friendships based on reciprocity instead of rescue. Relationships entered as whole people, not as saviors. Homes that became sanctuaries instead of open hospitals. Time that became precious. Energy that became sacred. They understood that protecting inner peace was not selfish. It was necessary for survival and essential for any real contribution they would make. The moment they stopped caring about other people's dysfunction was the moment they started caring for their own soul. The highest form of self-love, not narcissism, but the recognition that empathy is a gift that requires protection, boundaries, and conscious direction. You cannot pour from an empty cup. Martyrdom serves no one. Jung saw this as the birth of a sovereign individual, someone who had passed through unconscious empathy, through betrayal and collapse, through shadow integration, and emerged able to choose their own reality. They no longer reacted to emotional demands. They responded from wholeness. Every action became intentional. The empath who stops caring has not lost their humanity. They have found their power. They have not become cold. They have become conscious. They have not stopped loving. They have learned to love themselves with the same fierce devotion they once gave away without measure. This is why Jung called it the final stage of spiritual awakening. Not because growth is finished, but because the fundamental lesson has been integrated. Sensitivity is sacred. Energy is valuable. Peace is non-negotiable. Anyone who cannot respect those truths has no place in the life. This is not cruelty. This is clarity. The awakened empath becomes what the world needs and rarely deserves. Someone who can feel deeply without disappearing. Someone who can love powerfully without enabling dysfunction. Someone who can see clearly without turning cynical. Love with boundaries. Compassion with wisdom. Kindness with strength. Empathy with sovereignty. This is not a loss. It is a victory. Not over other people, but over the conditioning that said an empath's worth is measured by how much they are willing to sacrifice. The one who stops maintaining peace in toxic systems has begun cultivating peace in their own soul. They have rejected the lie that goodness requires suffering and that love demands self-abandonment. The moment the empath stops caring is not the end. It is the beginning of their sovereignty, and that is what the world actually needs. Not more people who empty themselves endlessly. More people who have learned to use the gift consciously, powerfully, and selectively. If this is landing for you, stay with it. You did not imagine the weight you have been carrying. You did not imagine the silence that arrived when you finally set it down. You earned this through every moment you suffered without speaking. You are not becoming less. You are becoming whole. Welcome to your awakening. You are finally free.